And it's one of the quickest, easiest ways to intervene in our mood. So if you're feeling low or sluggish, it makes exercise feel less arduous. It just helps us regulate, it helps our bodies to regulate themselves.
Gretchen, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, I'm so happy to be talking to you.
I'm really excited about this one today, and I'd love to dive right in because with the stresses of life, goodness, it's so easy for all of us to live in our head. And I want to start right there. Talk to us about getting out of our head and into the world each day. You had a really interesting trip to the eye doctor that sort of tripped this wire in your own life, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so I had a bad case of pink eye, and so I went to the eye doctor, and as we were finishing up, he said to me very casually, as if he were saying, be sure to wear your sunscreen or, drink enough water. He told me, well, be sure to come in for your regular checkup because, as you know, you're more at risk for losing your vision. And I said, I did not know that. What are you talking about? And he said, yes, you're extremely, extremely nearsighted, and that puts you at greater risk of having a detached retina. And if that happens, it can affect your vision. So we would want to catch it right away. And I have a friend who had just lost some of his vision to detached retina. So that felt like a very real possibility to me. So I walked out onto the street. I live in New York City, so I was getting ready to walk home. And I was looking all around me and thinking, oh my gosh, I love all this so much. And so often we don't appreciate something until we lose it or we fear we might lose it. And I realized, I'm thinking of how precious my sense of sight is. But I didn't notice a single thing on my way over here. I was all stuck in my head. I didn't see one thing. And of course I know that I would have a rich, meaningful life even if I lost one of my senses. But still, it made me realize how much I was overlooking. And with that realization, it was like every knob in my brain just got turned up to 11, and I could see every sight and hear every sound on a separate track, and I could smell every smell and smell in New York City with perfect clarity. It was all flooding in, and it lasted my whole walk home. It was this transcendent and almost psychedelic experience. And I realized this is happening all the time. I'm just not paying any attention to it. And I have been studying happiness and human nature for years, and I had known that there was something missing. I knew there was a puzzle piece that was not fit into the puzzle. And this showed me that this was the missing piece. This was the way that I could connect with other people and with the world and with myself. I could do it through the five senses.
I love that you said we don't often appreciate things until we either lose them or we fear we'll lose them. I want to talk on fear for a moment with you. How does fear collapse, Gretchen, in your opinion, our ability to fully engage with the fullness of life? Fear is powerful.
Well, I think that would be different for all of us because what we fear is different. So I think that's one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, what would I do or not do? What is fear causing me to do or not do that I would otherwise do?
How has that played out in your own life then? How has fear attempted to navigate your choices?
Well,
to engage with.
Here's something this is like a very perhaps minor example, but it's a very sure. Salient example for me. So I grew up I live in New York City, but I grew up in Kansas City. I got a driver's license when I was 16, but I'm a very fearful, skittish driver. And the same thing is true of my sister. My sister lives in LA. She's the co-host of the Happier podcast. So she lives in LA, and she lived there for like 3 or 4 years before she started driving, which if you live in LA is just bonkers. But now she does drive, but she also hates to drive, but she drives regularly. But because I live in New York City, I very, very rarely drive. And over time, because I am not driving much, I become more and more fearful. And I'm a perfectly good driver. It's just that I've become a fearful driver. And this is something where I took driver's lessons because I thought, well, maybe if I took driver's lessons, that would sort of make me feel more confident in my driving. But I actually had he was a very famous driving instructor, but it turned out to be a terrible fit for me, which I sort of didn't realize until later that he was like, actually, now I sort of feel like writing him a letter and being like, you were exactly the wrong kind of instructor, but whatever. And it's one of these things where I'm like, should I just say, hey, I'm not going to drive, give it up, don't worry about it? Or do I keep up with it? I think if I lived in a place where I drove all the time, I would be better off with this. But in New York City, it's just, you don't drive every day, which I love. It's one of my favorite things about New York City. But that's just an example where it just weighs on me because I'm a pretty fearful driver.
I want to step into some of the content of this new book because I never expected it to sort of grip me the way it did. And if I'm being totally honest, it took me a minute to start reading your book. Here's why. Because of the Andy Warhol quote you put on the first couple of pages.
Yes.
Nobody really looks at anything, he said. It's too hard. Gretchen, it was like, I don't know, like a lightning moment for me.
Good.
Tell me more about how that quote arrested your attention so much so that you're like, yep, I need to preface everything I'm about to tell people about with this. Nobody really looks at anything. It's too hard. What in the world?
I mean, I'm so happy to hear that you were struck by that quotation because it's like it pierces me to the heart every time I think about it. I don't even like the art of, like the visual art of Andy Warhol. He's the most extraordinary writer and interviewee. What he says and his thoughts are so wild. He says and thinks things that no one else can say or think. That is so interesting because I think we think of looking as something that you can do very casually and very automatically, and you're constantly looking at something. And the fact that nobody's looking at anything because it's too hard. And what would it mean to really look at something? To me, this was just a fascinating question. What would it mean to look at something? What did Andy Warhol mean when he was really looking at something? There are other Warhol quotations in the book, and I'd have to tell you, I went through and took out like 10 because you can't have a quotation in every paragraph. That's always in the end papers of the book, I have a lot of quotations because I had to pull so many out. But I think he just is calling our attention to the fact that if we were really, really going to take in something, it's arduous.
Okay, so what's the invitation therein for all of us, those joined with us in this conversation, as we step into this conversation about becoming more aware, more intentional, more intuitive, more focused? We can talk about this more. What's the invitation sort of out of that Warhol quote as we step into this conversation?
Well, one thing about the Warhol quotation is I think it almost sounds arduous, like it'd be a lot of work. Like I need to sit in front of a painting for an hour and look at it. I need to sip a cup of coffee for 20 minutes and focus on it. I need to do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 meditation. And those things work really well for some people. And I've tried some of those myself. But I have to say that my own approach is a much more playful, fun, lively, do what you want, have fun with it approach. Because I'm a very, very disciplined person. If anything, I'm too disciplined, I'm rigid. And I needed to find ways to play. I needed to give myself recess. And I wanted to do that through the 5 senses. And so and one of the things I love about the 5 senses is no matter what you're trying to achieve for yourself, to be happier, healthier, more productive, more creative, you can harness the 5 senses. And they can be contradictory. If you want to calm down, get more tranquility because you're really stressed out, you can use that. If you want to pump up, if you're feeling listless and sluggish, you can energize yourself. If you want to be productive and focused, you can use the 5 senses. If you want to unlock your creativity, you can use the 5 senses. If you want to reach into the past and evoke memories, you can use the 5 senses. If you want to be present in the moment, you can use the 5 senses. If you want to engage with other people, that's one of the best things to do with the 5 senses. So I think for some people, they use their 5 senses as a way to slow down, discipline the mind, have a very, very intense moment and engagement. That just happens not to be what I needed in my life. I'm already too intense. I need to play and have fun, and that's how I did it. So my way is kind of the fun way, I would say, the kind of because I think a lot of people expect there to be a lot of disciplining of the mind, and I'm like, that's a good thing to do. It's not really what I focused on in this approach in my book.
Yeah, so let's stay here. I want to dive into your backstory a little bit. You're a practitioner, really. This is not just you giving us research. You're saying, no, I do this. I've employed these things in my life, and my life is better as a result. So,
I'm more of a student, I would say, than even a practitioner.
Okay,
They say that research is me search, and that's definitely my way. If I have a personal challenge, I make it a professional project. So I'm always the student. So I'm trying things along there with everybody else. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me ask you one more question before I move on then. If you're a perpetual student, which I think is such a great way to live, what do you think are some good questions that all of us should be thinking about that open us up to be more learners than living in a level of rigidity? I think about self-protection and isolation coming out of the pandemic. That's a unique opportunity for us, Gretchen. How do we become better question askers, better learners, better students, as you've endeavored to do?
I think it begins with something that you want to learn more about. And I think sometimes people are very judgmental with themselves about what they want to learn more about. Like they think certain things are sort of legitimate, or they want to fit an idea of what kind of person they should be. And I think we always just have to say, well, who am I really? Like, what's actually true for me? And one kind of minor way that you see this, I think, coming up is with a book club. Because some people, it's like, I would have a book club. If I did a book club, it would be like a public policy book club. And that's great. If you want to do a public policy book club, that's fantastic. I know people where they're reading those books all the time. But then I've talked to people where they're like, you know what? With my book club, we read one. People do this with my book sometimes. They'll read one chapter a month because they're like, the fact is about our book club, we don't get a lot of reading done. So we're going to keep it very limited. I talked to a guy in his book club. Again, they're like, we're not going to read whole books. It's just like, that's just not the reality of the people that are in this book club. So what they did is they would take turns choosing profiles from the New Yorker magazine, which you can get online. They're like 4,000 words. And they're often like, a lot of these are very, very famous profiles written by, outstanding writers about like really outstanding figures. And so they're masterful and they're fascinating, but they're limited. And it's like, you could just get this on the internet. Some people do podcasts, things where they listen to an episode of podcast and talk about it. Some people do Real Housewives, like whatever works for you, whatever you're interested in, whatever you want to dive into. Because I think sometimes people are like, well, I should be interested in this, but I'm really not. So then they don't spend any time on it. Whereas I was like, well, maybe there's something that you really are interested in. And often the more you know, the more you notice, the more you learn, the more curious you become. And I think a really fun thing to do is just to say to yourself, I'm going to become a minor expert in something. You could be a minor expert in anything, and learn about it as much as you can. And from there, there's so much pleasure. And I think curiosity builds on knowledge, rather than, like I look about myself and happiness. People are like, are you tired of studying happiness? I'm like, I'm more interested in happiness than ever. The more I learn about it, the more fascinated I become. Or like with Life in 5 Senses, I go to the Met every day. I did that for
every day.
I did that for a year, but I'm like, I'm still doing it. Gosh. It becomes more interesting. Now, not everybody's like this. Some people want a lot more variety. I'm a person who doesn't need a lot of variety. I love doing the same things. I find but me like Andy Warhol, right? Like
me too.
Right?
Yeah.
This repetition. There's a lot of fascinating things in repetition. But so I think I think sometimes people have to admit what they're actually interested in.
Okay then. Teach us how to bring curiosity in different experiences in life. How did you bring curiosity, even being more present in the 5 senses, into being interviewed by Oprah, time with the Dalai Lama, dinner with a Nobel Prize winner? Goodness, Gretchen. It's fascinating.
Well, the funny thing about the interview with Oprah is it was such an out-of-body experience that I have no recollection of it. The only thing it was filmed outside, and she has like this tea house garden. So there were sort of smells of like it, and it was all closed in for the filming, but it was kind of an outdoor space, so there was sort of this outdoor smell and like grass around. So it was very outdoorsy. But I don't remember anything. It just was like it was just so intense that I think my short-term memory just shut down. So that was like a thing where my senses kind of didn't operate. It was just that the circuits were overloaded. But I'm not sure that there's any other time in my life where I maybe like giving birth. It's just sort of like there's so much happening that you kind of can't hang on to it. Um, yeah, the Dalai Lama, I was with him. It was raining, so and it was slippery, and you really don't want the Dalai Lama to like slip and break his hip or something. So I was very anxious about, okay, do we have solid footing here? Do I have a tight grip on his arm? Like, is the umbrella overhead? He seemed completely at ease, but I was a little bit overawed by the responsibility of helping him navigate a wet sidewalk.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so when we learn how to engage with our five senses better, what's unlocked for us? I want to set this as a precursor before we dive in.
Just about anything you want. I mean, that was the thing that really surprised me, and it almost got kind of out of control because as I was as I was trying to write the book, I wanted it to be, coherent, and I just sort of felt like I kept thinking of more and more things I wanted to try. And it's sort of like it kind of, because usually when I wrote about habits or about happiness, there are things like certain things work and certain things don't work. And so you sort of refine your thinking that way, or that's how I refine my thinking. Or I see how certain things work for certain people, but they don't work for others. But then with this, I was sort of like, this just feels like a tool that anybody can use for any purpose. I was like, this is like, and I think part of it is that you don't need to make an appointment. You don't need to learn how to do something. You don't need to buy anything. It's like it's all around you all the time. It's so concrete to us and it's so familiar and available that it's something where, and it kind of unlocks the imagination. Because if you said to me like, okay, I want to appreciate the moment better. And I was like, okay, figure that out. I think a lot of people would say, well, I don't really know exactly what I mean by that or how I would do it. It's like, I know I want that, but I don't really know what I would do like starting tomorrow toward that aim. But if I said to you, I want you to appreciate the moment more through your five senses, I think most people would be like, wow, okay, I can think of some things that I would do. Like I might do this, I might do that, I might try these things. But there's something about the concreteness of the five senses and the fact that there are five. So maybe you're really into hearing, like maybe you really appreciate the sense of smell, like me. Maybe maybe you're intrigued by your sense of touch. It's concrete and flexible, and yet you can personalize it. Maybe you live in the country. Maybe you live in New York City like me and you're surrounded by concrete. Like it's very adaptable to whatever circumstance works for you. Maybe you don't have all five of your senses. Maybe one of your senses is off the table. Okay, well then what would you do with what you have? Because, there's still a lot remaining.
Yeah, so let's get into the weeds with this. Foreground senses versus background senses. Take us in. What's important to know?
Yeah, well, and this was something that even after the book came out, I'm still like so engaged in it that I developed a quiz after I had turned in my manuscript called "What's Your Neglected Sense?" So people can take this quiz. It's at GretchenRubin.com/quiz. It's free. It's super fun. And it will tell you your neglected sense. So most of us have appreciated senses and neglected senses. So appreciated senses are the senses that are in the foreground. So I write about the foreground senses. And these are the senses that you're very aware of. And you turn to them for fun. You're interested in exploring them, having adventures. You probably enjoy reminiscing about them or learning more about them, like reading reviews or, planning trips or whatever around this sense. You often turn to it for comfort or pleasure. But then there are neglected senses. So these are in the background for you. And these are senses where you don't typically go out of your way to have new experiences with this sense. You are not that interested in learning more about it. You probably don't turn to it for comfort or pleasure. And you may be more aware of avoiding the negative than appreciating the positive of that sense. And so it's really handy to know your neglected sense because this is where you have low-hanging fruit. Because with your appreciated sense, they're already in the foreground of your attention. You're already paying attention to them. But with the neglected sense, this is something that for you is kind of fading into the background. And this is a place where you're like, well, now you can tap into it. Now that your attention is brought to it, you can think of, how could I engage with more people through this sense? How could I turn to it for comfort? How could I get pleasure? What is a fun adventure that I could plan that would draw out this sense for me? And so So finding out what your neglected sense is a really helpful way to know yourself better and to think about kind of new avenues for exploration.
Cool. Well, yeah, you had mentioned the survey available on your website. Yep. You've obviously curated a level of responses. I'm just curious, which of the 5 senses do most people neglect?
Well, that's very interesting because they're very evenly distributed.
Really?
Yes, and I was surprised by this because I have to say I thought almost no one would have sight. I thought that would be almost non-existent because we're hardwired for sight as humans. Sight has the most real estate in the brain. It's the most sophisticated circuitry. And if there is a conflict among the senses, sight almost always trumps. So sight is kind of in a special position. After sight is hearing, and then the others are trailing. But so I thought, well, just kind of as human beings, nobody would have that. Turns out, just about the same answers for all 5. But appreciated, no. Clear winners among appreciated. And the funny thing is, those senses are my most neglected senses. So that tells you, like, I'm coming at this in kind of a... And I think that helps when, and I know I saw this in my book Better Than Before, because I'm I'm an unusual person when it comes to habit formation. I think that gave me a certain kind of clarity because I saw things differently from the way most people saw them. And again, with the senses, my most neglected sense is taste, and my second most neglected sense is hearing. And those are the 2 that are the most often the most appreciated senses. So how about you? Did you take the quiz or do you have a guess?
No, I haven't yet. I actually didn't know about it until you just mentioned it.
Yeah, because I didn't get it into the book. I thought of it later. I was so frustrated. Yeah. So what do you think? If you had to guess, do you have a guess or you don't know? Some people don't know, but some people do.
Yeah, I could take a solid guess. So I'm a musician.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm very moved by hearing. I have very acute hearing too. I told a friend the other day, Gretchen, I was waking up in the morning and I heard a piece of paper fall off the coffee table in the living room.
Wow.
So it's very acute.
Mm-hmm.
As a musician, I can detect pitch and tone. I love accents and language.
Yes.
And so I can sort of detect languages in other people and go, oh, that's
right.
Down to dialect.
Right. That's Louisville or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. But sight is also really like, I love beauty. I love art. I love a beautiful sunny day. I love looking into the sky, the blue sky, and but yeah. But I'm also a foodie, so there's that too, Gretchen. I'm a total foodie, actually. It takes me back to precious moments in my life. I have a question I want to ask you later about taste, but I'll save it for now. But yeah, those are really pronounced.
Oh, interesting. Well, then maybe it's touch, maybe it's smell. Now, of course,
because of my background.
Yeah. It's interesting because, of course, smell and taste are so closely linked because to have flavor, we really have to have taste and smell, which I think a lot of people didn't really know until COVID. I think because so many people in COVID lost their sense of smell, and a lot of times people learned this because they knew something was wrong with their sense of taste. But in everyday life, we don't realize how closely we sort of have. There's sort of an illusion that all flavor is coming through our mouth, but it's our. And there's actually a really interesting experiment you can do with this just in your own home. If you have something like a jelly bean, like a Jelly Belly is perfect. You plug your nose and you pop in the jelly bean and chew it a few times. And what you'll find is that it's very sweet, because we have the 5 basic tastes: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. And you will have like a sugar explosion. It will taste very, very sweet. Then if you unplug your nose, you will instantly get a rush of like root beer or bubble gum or pina colada or cherry or whatever the Jelly Belly, like the complex flavor is. But if you can't smell it, all you get is sweet. Yeah. So it's...
Whoa. So the combination of the senses almost brings nuance, is what I hear you saying in a way.
Well, for that, yeah. No, but it's very interesting. And originally in one of the drafts of the book, I had a whole chapter called Sensorium The sensorium is the senses working together. And that's actually a very much more accurate way to think about the senses, because it's pretty, in everyday life, it's pretty unusual for us to like really pinpoint one of the five senses and really like focus on that. We're much more aware. If I eat a bowl of raspberries, I'm feeling them squish, and that kind of hairy texture. I'm smelling them. I'm looking at the beautiful color. I'm feeling the weight of the bowl. I'm hearing that my own chomping. All of that is giving me the feeling of raspberry. I'm not, but it is fun to kind of also like peel off each individual and note how it's adding to our experience.
You tipped your hat to this earlier in the conversation, but I'm just deeply curious about it. So you've worked in a lot of areas regarding happiness and written about it and talked about it. Here we are talking about the five senses. What's your macro passion for people then? What do you want people to live more integrated, present lives? What's the drive?
What's my drive?
Yeah, for that you would write and research about five senses, that you would write and research about happiness. What's the passion point that you want to that is driving you to serve people in this way?
I'm interested in human nature. That is really my subject is, who are we? How do we know who we are? How can we change if we want to change? And it's funny because like I wrote, like some of my earlier books were like a biography of Winston Churchill, and people are like, "Why? That doesn't make any sense." I'm like, it absolutely makes sense, because to me, I'm interested in human nature. And with someone like Winston Churchill, he's such a gigantic figure. He did so much, and there's so much, evidence, you can look at so many aspects of his life that it's like he's easier to study because he's just on such a gigantic scale. And so you can see things by studying his life that then I can understand everyday life, also. But so I think that I'm always just trying to understand human nature. That's my big, and then trying to help everybody understand themselves. Yeah, and myself.
What did Winston Churchill's life teach you about life, leadership, people? I'd love to know. What a historical hero he is.
Well, so my book, 40 Ways to Look at Winston Churchill, is a kind of a short, unconventional biography of Winston Churchill. And I got the idea for this book because I was talking to my husband, and I was like, the thing about this, I was just sort of early in my preoccupation with Winston Churchill. So I was just reading about it kind of for fun, one after the other. And I said to him, you could write a biography of Winston Churchill that would be incredibly laudatory, that would be full of praise. You could also write a biography of Winston Churchill that would be extraordinarily critical. And they would both be true. They would both be factually accurate. And he said, you could write a biography like that. And I was like, bam, yes, I could, and I will. So what I do in 40 Ways to Look at Winston Churchill is I look at him in 40 different ways. And I show how he is praiseworthy, but he's also, you could also deeply, deeply object to many things he did and said. I try to show how he was shaped by his own experience, his complicated relationship with his father, his vision for England and for the world, his incredible love of war, which you may applaud or you may, decry. And it's funny because I wanted to write a book because I'm so fascinated by Winston Churchill. I wanted to write a book that would make everybody in the world as fascinated by Winston Churchill as I was. So I wanted to write like the gateway drug of Winston Churchill. But what I found when the book came out, one of the things they tell you about books is you don't know who the audience for a book is until the book is out. It's when it's too late. And what I found is the people who love this book are people who already know a ton about Winston Churchill. So they have their own thoughts about the complexity of his history and his character. And so they appreciate like trying to think about it in all these different facets. It's not so much for the person who knows nothing about Winston Churchill because it's for the deep. The other thing that I learned from Winston Churchill, which I think about every day, is writing. He was such a brilliant writer. It was a challenge to write a book about him because he himself was such an extraordinary writer that, kind of threw my stuff into the shade. But I learned so much about using grandiloquent language, which Churchill was a master of just, this high language, but then also bringing it down to these monosyllables. Give us the tools and we will finish the job. He could really, and just the way, not so focused on accuracy, In his histories, they're brilliant, they're fascinating, not so factually accurate, so you want to know that going in, but brilliant and fascinating. His vision of the world. Yeah. So gosh, what a joy it was to write that. Every book I write, I think I will never enjoy writing a book as much as this one. It's all downhill from here. And then each one I'm like, nope, this one is the best. And then I think back on the other books, I'm like, oh no, I love writing that book so much. Churchill, what a joy it was to write that book.
Well, this is really fascinating, Gretchen, because I'd love to connect what you just said about him, his vision for the world. Mm-hmm. Sight dominates the five senses. Mm-hmm. Can we double click on that a little bit more? Why? What is it about not only physical vision, but internal motivating vision that really sets the course for life?
Well, with sight, I mean it very literally. I mean, that is the wiring of the brain. That's so that is the sight, that is vision, like with the eyeballs. With sight in terms of your vision for yourself, well, that's interesting, right? How one of the things you notice when you study the five senses is how deeply embedded they are in our metaphorical language, and that you kind of almost, I've tried not to pun out, to talk about grasping an idea or sniffing something out, and you just can't. You cannot communicate without drawing upon language that harkens to the five senses, because they're so much part of our experience. But yeah, so sight is like, where are we going? Where are you trying to go? So that's what you've got to figure out.
Yeah. What has this research taught you about the power of being present? Like, how many of us live distracted in the past or in concerns about tomorrow, yet we aren't quick to slow down enough to be here right now, to be engaged with our five senses?
Well, I think that's something that people really want. They feel like they aren't present in the moment. And so one of the things that's great about the five senses is they're happening right here, right now. Unlike you take a beautiful smell, you can't bookmark it. You can't save it for later. You can't even glut yourself on it. With a song that you love, you can listen to it on a loop all day long. But with the beautiful smell, you can only sniff it so many times, and then it fades out because of odor fatigue. The thing about the brain is it's a big, forceful editor. It tells us what we need to know, what it thinks we're interested in. It's not an objective reporter. So one of the ways that you can tune into the present is to really focus in on what is the information coming into me right now. Now, of course, though, in terms of thinking about the past, one of the superpowers of the senses is their ability to evoke the past. And there are memories called Proustian memories, which are memories that are triggered by a strong sensory sensation. Because, of course, Proust took a bite of a Madeleine cookie dipped in lime tea, and this unleashed a flood of memories from his childhood. But then many people will say, I walked into, a gas station and it smelled exactly like my grandparents' garage. Or I had an experience the other day where I walked by a construction shed on New York City and it reminded me of summer camp. And it took me a second to realize, why am I suddenly thinking about summer camp? And I'm like, oh, it's because the wet kind of wood that had been used to construct the shed must have been the same kind of wood that was like these kind of flimsy cabins that I stayed in summer camp, 1,000 years ago. And something about the smell, kind of the wet wood smell, somehow the conditions just made that connection in my brain, triggered unexpectedly as I was walking down the street. So this is a way that it both connects us to the present, and also can sometimes connect us to the past. If something is evoked. And of course we could do this deliberately. It's a great way to deliberately evoke memories is by seeking out memories related to sensations. Those are often easier to hook into than kind of just, if I said to you, what was third grade like, it might be hard to remember. But if I said, what did you eat for lunch in third grade? You might say, oh, well, I had a tin lunchbox and I would have a ho-ho in it, and I would unwrap it and flatten out the tinfoil. Or I ate a jelly sandwich every day for 5 years, all the way through grade school. Or maybe I had a school lunch, or whatever it might be. But then all of a sudden, what I've often found is that specific question will often start bringing back places and events and feelings because it's sort of been centered on something very specific. Whereas if you just sort of generally think back, you're like, I don't know. Like, who was my teacher in third grade? I don't really remember. But then, if you search for something very specific, often you find more.
You know what's really interesting, and I love that phrase that you just said. For me, as a case study, I am the exact opposite of what you just said. I don't have a distinct focal point or memory, but you said third grade. It took me instantly back. I can tell you about my teacher, the smell of the classroom, which classroom it was, what it looked like, the stage of my life. And so this is really interesting to me.
It's helpful. It's helpful. Yeah.
Moments ago, you said that the brain is a big, forceful editor, and I love that. So the question, I think, is do we see what we expect to see in life, sort of like confirmation bias, because you teach us in the book how to look for what's overlooked. I'd love to learn more.
Well, we do see what we expect to see. What the brain is looking for is change for the most part, because change is danger and change is opportunity. So if a rock is flying through the air, you're going to notice the rock. If the rock is lying on the ground, you might not notice that rock. And then often what we expect will shape our perception. So if I said to you, close your eyes, I'm going to put something under your nose, smell it. If I tell you what you're smelling is a bucket full of pine needles that I gathered in my backyard, you would have one impression. If I said I'm putting a bucket of a chemical floor cleaner, you would have a different impression. If you like something like Parmesan and vomit, it's like they're very easily confused if you don't have other cues. I had a funny experience where my daughter, I love a paper white narcissus. I have all these memories of paper whites growing up, kind of a holiday flower. But I'm an underbuyer, so year after year, I'm like, well, I should get one. We would enjoy it so much, but I'm not. Why should I spend the money? It just dies. But finally, I'm like, I'm writing a book about the five senses. I'm going to splurge and buy the paper white narcissus. So I had them sitting in our apartment, and my daughter and I were sitting near them, and I leaned in and I smelled them, and I said, oh, I love the smell of paper whites. And she said, oh, I didn't know they had a smell. So she leaned in and smelled them, and then she jerked back her head, and she said, oh my gosh, I don't like that smell at all. And I was like, well, because it is a very sharp, distinctive smell. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you didn't like it. She goes, I didn't know that's what that smell was. She said, I was afraid that maybe we had a mouse that had like died in the walls or something, because I kept smelling the smell. So, and I was like, oh, well, we can get rid of them if you hate the smell. And she goes, no, it's okay now that I know what it is. And then a couple days later, she came back to me and she said, now I kind of like the smell. Now that I know that it's the flower, I like it better. Because when her brain was like, what is this smell? Dead mouse. She was like, that's a bad smell. Then when her brain was like, oh, it's a lovely holiday flower that my mother loves, then her brain starts saying, well, let's think about the interpretation. Let's think about the associations. So the expectations that she was starting to form around them, even unconsciously by her, what was filling in, what the information was changing. And so once all that started to change, her experience started to change. Well, and about expectation, I mean, there's so much funny research about this. Like if I say to you, hey, here's a $150 bottle of wine, drink up, you're going to be like, this wine is amazing. If I'm like, this is a $15 bottle of wine, you'll be like, okay. Like you really, it tastes better. And this is the thing, when they study the brain, actually like pleasure centers are firing more. So you really are experiencing more pleasure. But the reason that you're experiencing more pleasure is that you expect to experience more pleasure. They've even done things where like if someone is very ecologically minded and they give them 2 cups of coffee and they're like, this cup of coffee was prepared with ingredients that were very, very ecologically advanced, that person will enjoy that coffee more and think that coffee tastes better than the regular old coffee, even if it's the same coffee. Because the brain is filling in this information. It is setting these expectations. And so, I mean, there are all kinds of fun, and it's like that old marketing thing. Like if you can't sell your perfume, charge twice as much. Because people will just think it smells better. If they think of, oh, this is rare and expensive, it must taste better. I mean, it must smell better. So yeah, the way the brain is in there fiddling around with what we're perceiving, it's nonstop.
Do our senses validate reality or just our perception?
Well, they create our reality. They are our reality. I mean, what reality is what is it? You know, like we only see part of, like we have the visible spectrum, but there's a lot of spectrum we don't see. Is it real? Of course it's real. So it's our reality. It's our reality. And color, I mean, color, what is color? Color there's no color without light, but there's no color without an eye. There's no color without a brain.
Right. Light, refraction,
So
all of that.
if the sun, if you're in a dark room, there is no color in there. There is no color. So is color real? I don't know.
I told you I'm a musician, and I love this part of the book. You said music improves our health. How so?
It can lower our heart rate. It can boost our immune function. It helps us focus. It helps us synchronize with other people, which is often like a very valuable to do. And it's one of the quickest, easiest ways to intervene in our mood. So if you're feeling low or sluggish, it makes exercise feel less arduous, which is why if people are doing, like work crews are working really hard, they'll often play music, or like in a gym, they play music and it makes it easier also for people to synchronize, say like you're rowing together. And then with our health, it just helps us regulate, or it helps our bodies to regulate themselves. It can help people experience less pain. But you know, it's interesting though, because you love music, and I'm guessing that it's one of your most appreciated senses. Like I had to have an MRI, and they said to me, "Oh, do you want to have music?" And I said no, because for me, that would make it, that kind of sensory input would make it more, I'm like, I'd rather just hear the machine. And they were like, really? Most people want the music. And I'm like, 100% not. But would you have taken the music? Would you have found that to make it like a less arduous procedure?
Oh, I love this. I actually had an MRI this past January.
Okay.
And they asked me the same question. And at first I said yes. And then 3 seconds in, I went, no, I can't do this. Because of the conflicting machine noises and the music, I felt overstimulated, stressed out, and started to get claustrophobic. I said, I would rather listen to the clicking of the MRI machine. And I was like, oh, there's a pattern to this. Yes. And that alone.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, okay, but see, I would have thought, like, part of it is also that you're not in control of the music. Like, if they said to you, hey, you can have your, I don't know, like, you know, because with the metal and everything, I don't know that this would be possible. But if they were like, you can have your own playlist, do you think if it had been music that you chose, do you think then you could have dialed into the music and ignored the machine? Or no, it's too much. It's like two conflicting inputs, where one is machines and one is music, and those two things do not go together.
Yeah, because they asked, what music do you want to listen to? And they had a Spotify play, and I told them. And they started to play it.
What was it? I'm just curious.
Musician,
what was your playlist?
Jazz.
Okay, all right.
And so, like old jazz, not new modern jazz, like old school
standards,
bebop, that kind of thing. Yeah, because I love music. Anyway, I started to hear the pitch of the MRI machine, and it was creating this dissonance with the key of the song, and I said, this is like listening to someone chew an apple, and I'm going to go nuts.
Oh my gosh, see, that's so fascinating. Okay, and so maybe, because you have such acute hearing, somebody was telling me that, so her kid, I guess she's kind of got a whiny kid, and they went into the pediatrician's office, and he kept saying, oh, I hear this noise, it's just bugging me so bad. And she was like dismissing this and thinking her kid was just like being whiny. And then when the pediatrician came in, she sort of made a joke about it. And he said, oh, no, we get a child from time to time who can hear the whining of this one machine. We know what it is. It's just most people can't hear it. And I thought, well, this is a child who is actually experiencing more annoyance in the world, hearing this like high-pitched sound, but other people are just oblivious to it. In fact, this is fascinating. So you know how, so if you study kind of supernatural phenomenon, one of the things I often point to is there are places where many people unrelatedly will be like, this place is spooky. And what's going on? And many people say, oh, I get a bad feeling here. Well, they think that part of why certain places feel spooky is that there's rumbling that's outside of our ability to hear it, but our bodies can pick it up. So it's something like if you're in a room and there's like a broken fan in a floor above you and it's turning, it could create something where part of your body is responding to it, but you're not hearing it. So you're like, what is going on? It creates this uneasiness, kind of like what you're saying. It's like there's something, it's not right. It's, and this causes this feeling of uneasiness in the body. So it's absolutely fascinating.
It's subconscious dissonance.
Yes.
I think, okay, now, do you know this is exactly why if you watch a suspenseful scene in movies, there will be often a fluorescent light that's kind of flicking on and off, or
yes.
or a fan.
Yes.
It is because of the suspense and the dissonance it causes physiologically.
Interesting. That makes perfect sense. Oh, it's such a cliche, too, like the flickering.
Gretchen.
Oh, yeah. Fascinating.
That's why.
But see this, there's a whole, and there's 1,000 books written about how to use the senses creatively and in art to create moods and pacing, because we are so susceptible to all these cues and we're so aware of it. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so connect this to mental and emotional health, because that's what this podcast is all about. Having our senses trained does what for our emotional health, our mental health, let alone, I'd say, just our maturity in life and our emotional intelligence?
Well, I think whatever someone is seeking in their emotional and mental health, because, okay, so let's say somebody is really seeking more serenity. They're feeling overwhelmed. They're feeling very stressed out. They kind of need comfort and solace, and they need to be able to sort of make themselves calmer. Well, one of the things that's fascinating with the senses is that, okay, it really depends person to person. So for me, I'm a person where if I'm very stressed out, I want to bring the sensory load down. So I'm not such a music listener, but if my husband's playing music in the kitchen, unthinkingly I'll turn it off because I'm just trying to bring it down. If the TV's on in the background, I turn it down. I usually wear perfume to bed. I love perfume. I'll stop wearing it because I just am bringing down my sensory load. If I'm reading or watching TV, I'll watch something that I've already seen because, again, it's familiar and I'm bringing down the load. But I've talked to people who are just the opposite. They will take a hot shower. They will plunge their hands into ice cold water. They'll put an ice cube in their mouth. They'll bite into a lemon. They'll eat spicy food. They'll play music, top volume. And for them, this kind of overstimulation of the senses actually calms them. And so that's a way where you're sort of like, well, maybe what works for other people doesn't work for me, but that's okay. A lot of time, I find that one of the great senses to use if you're trying to calm yourself is touch. If you can have appropriate touch from a human, so that's like getting a hug, or maybe you want to get like a massage, that helps relieve stress. Or maybe you want to like pet a cat or dog. That's another way to bring touch in. Maybe you just want like a soft, fleecy blanket. That can be very comforting. A weighted blanket. I was talking to a therapist who specializes in teenagers, and she was saying that, and I had never heard of this. She was saying a thing that some teenagers do is they get every blanket they can in the house and pile them up, and then they burrow under it like a little creature. And I said, well, is this like a weighted blanket? And she said, well, it's kind of like a weighted blanket, but it's kind of like also like this idea of burrowing in. Like they like being kind of in this like little blanket cave. And I thought, well, isn't that fascinating? Because it's a way of creating a sensory environment that's comforting and feels right. And I thought, how interesting. Also, she pointed out one of the things that teenagers do is they're very focused on like products, and they'll like put on all kinds of lotions and potions and take them off and put them on and experiment with makeup and all kinds of hair products and stuff. And she pointed out that this is really one of the ways we self-soothe is by touching ourselves. So like one of the things, I'm a big hair twister. I twist my hair a lot. My husband's a head patter. He'll just pat his head, which when you say someone pats their head, it sounds kind of weird, but if you look around your life, a lot of people do stuff like that, or people will like rub their arms, or they'll rub their hands up and down their legs. It's a way we soothe ourselves. And I thought, and she pointed out that this is a way teenagers are doing that. It's like people think it's because of vanity that they're focused, and she said, but really it's another way to bring in the pleasure of touch up to yourself. And she said, so maybe this is something that they're doing to help themselves achieve a greater sense of calm. I thought, well, what a great way to reframe this behavior that I certainly have seen in my two daughters in high school. I thought, well, maybe I completely misunderstood what was going on.
Okay, is there a threshold then whereby engaging with our five senses isn't the wisest choice? Let me set it up. Like when it comes time to making a choice way outside of our comfort zone, because stretching of our comfort, living outside of our comfort zone, doesn't immediately have this sensory validation to it in a lot of cases. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, like, what are you thinking of as an example? I mean, one place where it's not, where it often kind of tips into unhealthy is with the sense of taste. Rarely do people say like, oh, I really have a problem with my love of jazz. I really need to cut back on the jazz, or I need to stop looking at art books all the time. We don't have that problem, but people will often say like, I'm kind of dialing into my sense of taste too much. They feel like maybe overwhelmed by the sense of taste. And so one of the things to realize, this is sort of a hack that a lot of people have found useful, is that if you feel like you're reaching for your sense of taste to an unhealthy degree, maybe it's healthy for you, but maybe it's an unhealthy degree. Like you feel like if you're feeling bored or you're feeling listless or you're feeling restless, you're kind of heading to the kitchen, you're opening up the fridge, you're looking in a vending machine. If you feel like that's sort of, if you're reaching for that in a way that feels like unhealthy, one of the things you can do is you can just pick a different sense. So like you love music, so maybe when there's like new music, you're like, okay, I'm going to save it. And when I'm in one of those lull periods, that's going to be my go-to treat. That's my healthy treat. I'll save and so instead of wandering through the kitchen, I'll start listening to new music. Or like as I said, I love the sense of smell. I love perfumes, and I have all these samplers. I love buying a sampler, and I'll just like go do some samples. And it's like, it gives me a hit of pleasure. And I don't know. And then people kind of lose their desire to have the unhealthy snack. And I don't know if this is because it's just a distraction, because instead of going to the kitchen, you're like going to, get your playlist set up and get your AirPods in or whatever. Or is it really that it's just what the body is really seeking is some kind of stimulation, and it's like you're just sort of reaching for for taste because it's the obvious choice, and you could just substitute it with a different sense, and that kind of does the trick. Maybe it's probably both, a little bit of distraction, a little bit of like giving you that jolt of energy coming through the senses. Either way, a lot of people have said like, this is something that has really helped me change a habit for the better.
Well, let's stay on taste just for a moment more. A lot of times in times of stress or grief, we go to our favorite comfort food. Mm-hmm. Why? Is there any association to life experiences and that familiarity?
Oh, sure, 100%. That is why it is. That's why it is. It is just a sense of comfort. And I think that we're often told to do it. It's something that is like, it's very reinforced. So people, when they think of it as, I think it gets back to this idea of a treat, where they think, I need a treat, I need to give myself comfort. And just sort of the obvious example is, I'll get a chocolate chip cookie the way my mother used to make them, because it's like, I don't have a bottle of, the smell that will be like, oh, this is the smell of my third grade classroom that I love so much. It's something that is very easy to have access to. But it's something to be aware of, because it's great if it's a healthy treat and it really does give you that comfort. And I write about this a lot in my book, Better Than Before, that's all about how to change habits, is that you don't want to do something to make yourself feel better that just ends up making you feel worse. So if you're like, I'm going to make myself a cup of, hot milky tea the way my mom used to do, and that makes me feel great, that's one thing. But if you're like, you know what, all this comfort food, the minute that I've had it, I don't feel comforted, I feel lousy, and I wish that I hadn't done it, then that's not a good comforting activity.
Why is ketchup magic?
Ketchup is Heinz ketchup, which we all have Heinz ketchup falling out of our pockets.
Yeah.
It is one of the few foods that is all five of the basic tastes. It's sweet, it's sour, it's salty, it's bitter, and it's umami. And that It is umami, and it's a beautiful color. It's got a great mouthfeel. And this is why it's the secret ingredients in many foods like pad thai and meatloaf and Thousand Island dressing, places where you would not expect ketchup to show up. It's there because, and then you think of like, it's very hard to hit all 5. It's even hard to hit all 4. Like the margarita, which is an enormously popular drink. It's 4. It's sweet, it's sour, it's salty, it's bitter, but it's not umami. It's very hard to get all 5. And this is a really fun thing to do with your friends or your family, is just get out like a little taste of ketchup. And if you can, like turn out the lights, have them have a little taste and see if they even know what it is. Because when you really pay attention to it, you're like, this is so complex. My mouth is just like firing in all directions. There's all this aftertaste. You're like, what is happening? And it's just plain old Heinz ketchup.
Okay, I'm dying to ask this question. What surprised you most? You're in this research mode for this book, talking about the 5 senses. You're a student of life in this way, as you've said. What surprised you most?
What surprised me most is how all of us live in our own sensory worlds. Like it's genetics, it's upbringing, it's expectation, as you said earlier, it's interests, it's values, all these things. It's just like, we can't smell our home the way a guest smells it because of what's called odor fatigue, because our brain and our nose will adapt to what is most familiar. So you and I could walk into my apartment and you could smell air freshener or dog food or cats or any, and I just would not smell it. I live in New York City. Like, we're here doing this recording. There could be sirens going off. I will not hear them because my brain is just like, you don't need to pay any attention to those sirens. But you might be very aware of the sirens because you're paying attention to the sound quality. For you, because you love music, somebody was just telling me the other day, maybe you feel this way, that when he goes to a restaurant, the playlist of the restaurant is just as important to his enjoyment of the experience as the food. Whereas I'm like, I notice if the music is too loud, but if it's not too loud, then I just tune it out. I don't pay any attention to it at all. But he's like, oh, I've left restaurants because I can't stand their taste in music.
You have lived such a cool life, and wouldn't it be just like Gretchen Rubin to write a book called Life in 5 Senses? It's so cool. And I was just really intrigued in this conversation space around mental and emotional health. Like, what really, folks, lean in, listen. What really is it going to take for us to become more present, more engaged with the life that we're living? And I think this is a huge part of it. I want to land here. What was it like to clerk for a Supreme Court justice? What a life you've lived.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary experience. Yeah, it was a once in a lifetime experience. And of course, this was many, many years ago. But I clerked for Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and it's really people really trying to do their best by their own lights and do, the best possible work in service of the country. And so it was really an honor to be able to play a small role in the work that they do.
Because that's not just a job you apply for. I mean, this is the creme de la creme de la creme de la creme of the nation, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Folks, wintoday.tv, Life in 5 Senses. She is Gretchen Rubin. Gretchen, this has been so fun. Anything else today that would just add value to us or something we haven't covered that you need to just share?
I just want to say there's no right way or wrong way to do it. It's whatever the way is right for you. I think that for just about everyone, there's so much to be gained from paying attention to our 5 senses. I really hope that my book will help people find their own way to take delight in the world around us.
It's so good. Well, thanks for being here today. What a joy. What a gift.
Well, thank you. I feel like we could talk all day. Thank you.
You've got an open invitation to come back anytime, and I'd love to continue. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.